Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm glad you came. Okay, but what I had sent you two essays. The first one is probably the one of most interest. It's entitled The Ancient Sources of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. It is also sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, which means in Greek 5 books. And of course, the books of Moses, because it was believed a long time ago, before the scholars got at the text of the things and did all of their detailed study of these 5 books in the original Hebrew and connected what they read with what they knew of ancient Israel's history, that we began to understand how these 5 books came into being, what the sources were. It wasn't just one author who wrote the texts of these books, and when they were put together. Now, it's kind of a complicated story, so I'll try to make it as simple as I can. First of all, the study of the Torah in detail began with German Old Testament scholars in the 19th century. Somehow, everything biblical and theological comes out of Germany. I think it has something to do with the fact that Luther was a German. I don't know. Anyway, they of course were trained academics who could read in the original language and who knew the history, and these people were very, very learned people. Okay, so they began studying the texts of these 5 books in great detail. And what they discovered was that there are actually 4 sources that went into these 5 books. 4 separate sources, okay? And they were able to determine this in a couple of ways. Number 1, different sources refer to God with a different name, okay? One source refers to God as Yahweh from beginning to end. And so that means that you find the word Yahweh in the book of Genesis. Another source refers to God as Elohim and doesn't refer to God as Yahweh until the story of Moses, when Moses asks the burning bush, "What is your name?" And God says, Yahweh, which means I am who I am. All right, so that's a different source completely. All right. Thirdly, the different sources portray God in different ways. The first source I mentioned, which we'll go into detail here in a second, the first source I mentioned portrays God in a more anthropomorphic way. In other words, God walks in the garden, okay, like in the cool of the day, like a human being would. Or God talks directly to people. They hear him, what he says. And so God is portrayed as not so transcendent and so far above and beyond human life that God can't also be understood as one who is present and communicating with us in ways we can understand. The other source portrays God in a more transcendent way. That means God appears to people through dreams. Remember Joseph? Okay, he had those dreams.
Jacob, the ladder that went up to heaven, okay, that was a vision. Okay, so another source portrays God as communicating through visions, dreams, in other words, indirectly, right? Not directly. And then yet another source portrays God as so transcendent that there's not any direct communication at all. So these are just some of the details that enabled the scholars to see that we have here different sources that have been put together to form what we call the Pentateuch or the Torah or the books of Moses. Okay? Now, let's start at the end, and then we'll go to the beginning. When was this put together the way we have it now? It was put together the way we have it now when the Jews had been defeated by the Babylonians and exiled to Babylon. When they were there, it became absolutely necessary. Let me make a comparison here first. When were the Gospels written? The Gospels were written as the apostles began to die out. And the church didn't have eyewitnesses anymore. So the church decided, we've got to get the testimony of the apostles on paper so we can pass it on to different generations as time goes by. The original apostles thought Christ was going to return in their lifetime. So I didn't see any reason to write it down. Okay? In the same sense, the Jews are in a foreign country. They have no idea if they're ever going to get back to their own land. The Judeans were sent to Babylon, and that's where they gathered all of these sources which make up the Pentateuch into what we have today. Okay? Now, the sources are well, first of all, let me just give you a one-sentence summary of what each of these books is about, okay? So Genesis has two parts to it. The first 11 chapters are prehistory, before recorded history. That sets the stage for the story of salvation. And then the story of salvation begins with Abraham in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis. And the rest of Genesis is the story of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Okay. That ends Genesis. Exodus is the story of how Moses freed the Hebrew tribes from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the Sinai desert into, finally, the Jordan River Valley. And when they were about to cross over into the Promised Land, Moses dies and Joshua takes over. Okay? That's what Exodus is about. Leviticus comes from the word Levites. Okay? The Levites were the tribe that made up the priests of Israel. Okay? Levi was one of the sons of Jacob, and his descendants became the priests. Some think because they descended from Moses' brother Aaron. Okay, so Leviticus is about the laws, the ordinances, all the rules and regulations beyond the Ten Commandments that the Jews are to follow. And the idea is, the idea behind all these rules and regulations is that, okay, God chose the descendants of Abraham set them apart to be God's chosen people, and therefore they are to live differently than the people of all the other nations. They are to have a very unique identity. And as long as they follow these rules and regulations and ordinances and stipulations and everything else, and are obedient to God's commands, then they are being faithful to God. They're obeying the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, by obeying these laws. And they become a unique people. Okay? A kingdom of priests, they're even called. Okay, so the book of Leviticus has all these laws in it. If you want to ever put yourself to sleep, open the book of Leviticus and start reading. Okay. Some of those rules and regulations might be shocking to you. I'm just warning you in advance. Okay. The book of Numbers is really Exodus part 2. Okay. The reason that you got the name Numbers is because it started out numbering the number of young men who could serve in the military to conquer the Promised Land. That's why it's called Numbers in Greek, Latin, and English. In Hebrew, it's called In the Wilderness, because Numbers consists of all the stories of the people making their way to the Promised Land. There's tons of stories strung together, all these incidents that happen while they make their way to the Promised Land. And there's some repetition between Exodus and Numbers. There are some stories that are the same. For example, there's the Exodus version of getting the Ten Commandments, and there's the Numbers version of getting the Ten Commandments. So you have two separate stories. Okay, they're not inconsistent with each other, but it's a different language and it's told in a different way. Okay, so that's the book of Numbers. The book of Deuteronomy is the only book that really comes from a single source. Okay, Deuteronomy means the law the second time, in Greek. Deutero, two, onomy, law. Okay, so it's purported to be a series of sermons given by Moses as the people are about to enter the Promised Land. Moses tells them what's expected of them. If you obey the Lord your God and observe all of his laws, ordinances, and stipulations, and if you are faithful to the Lord your God, and if you love the Lord your God and give a tenth of your produce back to God as an offering of gratitude, if you do all these things, God will protect you from your enemies and you will prosper. If you don't do them, God will give you up to your enemies and things will go very badly for you. That's really the bottom line message of the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? Obey God and things go well. Disobey God and look out, you're in trouble. All right? Okay, so that is, and by the way, that point of view, obey God and things go well, disobey and things don't go well, is used as the interpretive key in the books of Samuel and Kings when the story of the kings is told. Because it will start out, then King so-and-so came to power. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and therefore these disasters happened. And then we'll get to the next king. Then so-and-so came to power. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and therefore all these wonderful things happened. Okay? So if you ever decide you want to read through that, that's what you're going to find. Okay, so the book of Deuteronomy had a major impact on how the story of Israel was told, the story of ancient Israel was told. Okay, so the sources. All right, so the people get to Babylon. They need to preserve their identity as God's people. How are they going to do that? There's no longer a temple. Okay, these are the things that define them as a people. Number one, the land they lived on. God gave them that land. They don't have it anymore. Number two, the temple in Jerusalem. The Babylonians destroyed it. They don't have it anymore. The Ark of the Covenant is gone. They don't know where it is. So even the original stones on which God carved the Ten Commandments, even that is gone, and they don't know where it is. So what do they have left? Well, what they have left are the laws of Moses, right? Okay, so they gather all the sources and stories that were preserved before they were exiled, and they put them together into one narrative while they're in exile in Babylon. Okay, now what are the sources? Number one, the first source is called Y or J, because that is the source that refers to God as Yahweh. Okay, and the first letter is Y, or J. Now, some groups, you will hear some Christian groups call God Jehovah. That is based on a mistaken idea of what the consonants or what the vowels are that go between the consonants Y, H, something W. Okay, so that source, which refers to Yahweh, even in the beginning of Genesis as Yahweh, came from the southern kingdom. Okay? Because most of the geographical, so there's a number of evidence for that. Most of the geographical sites mentioned are in the southern kingdom. And it concerns things that were importance to the tribes to the south. The other source is called E, Elohim. Now, in Y, that's where God is portrayed as closer to people and approachable. And, for example, there are stories where God smells odors. Remember the story where Abraham argues with God over the destruction of Sodom? Okay, God says, these Sodom and Gomorrah are evil, I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham says, well, far be it from you, the Lord. What if there are 20 righteous people in Sodom? Would you still destroy it? Well, for the sake of the 20, I'll preserve it. And then Moses says, well, pardon me, Lord, but what if there are 10? Okay, so for the sake of the 10, I won't destroy it. Oh, let the Lord not get mad at me. What if there are 5? So he argues with God. See, that's J. All right. E, in the Elohist source, God is listed as more remote. For example, the stories of the dreams that the patriarchs had, Joseph and Jacob, those come from that source. this geographical setting of the E narratives is in the northern part of Israel. So it is believed that when the people were banished to Babylon, the people from the northern kingdom had preserved Y. The people from the northern kingdom had preserved what is called E, after the word Elohim. Okay? And those two were put together. All right? Another example of where you can see that there are different documents put together here is the fact that there are two stories of creation. You've got the first story, which is God creates everything in 6 days, and then hallows the seventh day as the Sabbath. Okay, then you've got the story of Adam and Eve, the snake, temptation, and sin comes into the world. All right? The first story was written by a third source, which I haven't mentioned yet, called the priestly source. The priestly source is the source that was composed by the priestly class, because it has to do with concerns that the priests would have had in terms of the way the Hebrew people lived. Okay, so take the first story of creation. God is portrayed as transcendent, above, above all of creation, and he hallows the Sabbath and commands people to observe the Sabbath. That was a priestly concern. So that is a priestly document. Okay? So you got so far now J from the south, or Y. You got E from the northern kingdom, Elohim. You got P, which is the priestly source. And then you've got D, which is simply the book of Deuteronomy, which is separate from all three of those other sources. All right? So I explain in a brief way all of those sources in this essay I sent you. If anybody wants it sent again, I can do that. It's not a problem. So just...
the land and history one?
No, it's called Ancient Sources of the Torah.
Yeah, that, I have the other one, I don't have that.
Okay, everybody, thanks for coming.
Thank you.